Every morning at exactly 7:42 a.m., neighbors on Maple Street witness the same peculiar sight: a small girl with auburn braids walking to school completely alone, while dozens of other children laugh and chatter in groups around her. What they don't see is the invisible barrier Charlotte has built around herself, a protective shield born from a secret that would change how everyone views this quiet, observant child. Behind her calm exterior lies a mind that processes the world differently, noticing details others miss, hearing conversations others ignore, and understanding truths that adults spend years trying to grasp. This is the story of why Charlotte chooses solitude over friendship, silence over noise, and observation over participation, and how her unique perspective ultimately becomes her greatest strength. Charlotte's worn sneakers made soft tapping sounds against the sidewalk as she walked down Maple Street on that crisp October morning. The autumn leaves crunched beneath her feet, creating a rhythmic pattern that only she seemed to notice. Around her, the familiar chaos of children heading to school unfolded like a daily theater performance, one she observed from the wings rather than participating on stage. Sarah Mitchell and Emma Rodriguez walked just 20 feet ahead, their voices carrying back to Charlotte on the morning breeze. They were discussing the upcoming school dance, their words overlapping in excitement about dresses and decorations. Charlotte could have easily quickened her pace to join them. They had been friends once, back in third grade, when friendships were simpler and required nothing more than sharing crayons and sitting together at lunch. But that was before Charlotte began to notice things. She noticed how Sarah's voice changed when she talked about her parents' recent arguments, becoming higher and more forced. She noticed how Emma's lunch money mysteriously disappeared every Tuesday, the same day her older brother Jake walked her to school with an unusually tight grip on her backpack. She noticed the way their teacher, Mrs. Henderson, rubbed her temples during math lessons and how the principal missed her. Garcia always checked his phone exactly at 2:15 p.m., his face growing worried each time. Most 11-year-olds notice when it's their turn for show and tell or when lunch is served. Charlotte noticed the weight of unspoken words, the spaces between what people said and what they meant. This gift of observation, as her grandmother called it, had become both her superpower and her burden. The school building loomed ahead, its red brick facade familiar, yet somehow different each day. Charlotte paused at the edge of the playground, watching the social dynamics unfold with the precision of a nature documentarian studying animal behavior. Near the basketball court, Jeremy Walsh was showing off his new shoes to a cluster of admiring boys. But Charlotte noticed the careful way he positioned himself to hide the hole in his backpack, and how his eyes darted nervously toward the school entrance where his mother usually waved goodbye, except his mother hadn't been there for the past week. By the swings, a group of girls from her class were engaged in what appeared to be lighthearted gossip. To most observers, it looked like typical childhood chatter. Charlotte saw something different. She observed the subtle exclusion of Maya Patel, how the circle closed slightly when Maya approached, how the conversation shifted to topics Maya couldn't contribute to, sleepover parties Maya wasn't invited to, inside jokes Maya wasn't part of. She watched Maya's shoulders drop almost imperceptibly, the way she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear 3 times in 30 seconds, a nervous habit Charlotte had cataloged months ago. This was why Charlotte walked alone, not because she couldn't make friends, but because she saw too much. She understood that Jeremy's bravado masked his worry about his missing mother. She recognized that the popular girls' cruelty toward Maya stemmed from their own insecurities rather than anything Maya had done. She knew that grown-ups talked about children as if they were deaf, sharing concerns and secrets and voices just low enough to seem private, but loud enough for observant ears to hear. Charlotte climbed the front steps of Riverside Elementary, her hand trailing along the worn metal railing. In the hallway, she passed the bulletin board where student artwork was displayed. Her own drawing wasn't there, not because it lacked artistic merit, but because it had made Mrs. Henderson uncomfortable. While other students had drawn typical family portraits with stick figures holding hands under rainbow skies, Charlotte had drawn her family sitting around their dinner table, each person looking in a different direction. Her father stared at his phone. Her mother gazed out the window. Her older brother Alex focused on his plate, and Charlotte herself looked directly at the viewer with knowing eyes. When Mrs. Henderson had asked her to explain the drawing, Charlotte had simply said, "This is how we really sit at dinner." The teacher had quietly removed it from the display pile. Her homeroom was already buzzing with morning energy when Charlotte took her seat in the third row, second from the window. This strategic position allowed her to observe both her classmates and the playground outside, where later rivals hurried toward the building. She pulled out her notebook, not the one assigned for schoolwork, but her personal observation journal, its pages filled with careful notes about the people around her. Today's entry began, October 15th, Jeremy's mother still missing from morning routine. Maya wore the same sweater 3 days in a row, which means laundry problems at home or favorite comfort item. Emma brought lunch money today, unusual for Tuesday pattern. Mrs. Henderson entered the classroom carrying a stack of papers and wearing what Charlotte had come to recognize as her difficult conversation expression, lips pressed slightly together, eyes focused on her desk rather than the students. This look usually preceded announcements about budget cuts, schedule changes, or disciplinary issues. As the morning progressed, Charlotte's observations proved accurate. Mrs. Henderson announced that the school's art program was being reduced due to funding issues. She explained it gently, but Charlotte heard the frustration beneath her careful words. She also noticed how Mrs. Henderson's eyes lingered on Jeremy when discussing the importance of family support during transitions, confirming Charlotte's suspicions about his home situation. During lunch, Charlotte sat at her usual spot at the edge of the cafeteria, a position that offered a panoramic view of the social ecosystem. She ate her peanut butter and jelly sandwich, made by herself that morning because her mother had left for work early again, and continued her observations. At table 3, the soccer team discussed their upcoming game, but Charlotte noticed how Danny Martinez, usually the most vocal player, remained quiet and kept flexing his right ankle under the table. An injury he was hiding from the coach, she deduced. At table 7, the book club girls were engaged in animated discussion about their latest read, but Charlotte observed how Lisa Chun kept glancing toward the popular kids table with longing, her participation in the book discussion half-hearted at best. The most interesting observation came from the teacher's table in the corner. Charlotte had learned to read lips the previous summer when her grandfather had begun losing his hearing, and this skill proved invaluable for understanding adult conversations. Mrs. Henderson and Mr. Murphy, the 5th grade teacher, were discussing budget cuts in more detail than they had shared with students. Charlotte read phrases like potential layoffs and reduced services on their lips, information that explained Mrs. Henderson's increased stress levels over the past month. After lunch, Charlotte walked to her next class through hallways filled with typical middle school noise. Locker doors slamming, sneakers squeaking on linoleum, voices calling out to friends. But underneath this surface chaos, she detected subtler sounds that told different stories. She heard the quiet sniffling from the bathroom that indicated someone was crying inside. She noticed the urgent whispers between 2 teachers near the principal's office, their body language suggesting serious concern about a student or parent. In science class, Charlotte's observational skills took on a different dimension. While other students struggled to understand the concept of animal adaptation, Charlotte grasped it immediately, not from the textbook, but from her daily observations of human behavior. She understood that Jeremy's bragging was camouflage for his anxiety, that Maya's withdrawn behavior was protective coloration in a hostile social environment, that even her own solitary walking was a form of adaptation to her unique way of experiencing the world. Mr. Peterson, the science teacher, was explaining how some animals developed enhanced senses to survive in their environments. Certain birds can detect magnetic fields to navigate during migration, he said, unaware that Charlotte was mentally noting how he unconsciously favored his left leg when standing, suggesting an old injury or current pain. When Mr. Peterson asked for examples of enhanced senses in animals, Charlotte raised her hand, a rare occurrence that caused several classmates to turn and stare. Some animals develop better hearing or vision than others in their species, she said carefully. It helps them survive, but it might also make them different from the group. Mr. Peterson nodded approvingly, not realizing that Charlotte was describing her own experience as much as any animal adaptation. The afternoon passed with Charlotte, continuing to gather information about the intricate social world around her. She noticed how the substitute librarian kept checking the time and looking toward the parking lot, clearly uncomfortable in an unfamiliar environment. She observed the way the custodian, Mr. Williams, slowed his cleaning routine near classrooms where he could overhear lessons, suggesting he valued learning despite not having formal education opportunities. As the school day ended and students flooded toward the exits, Charlotte remained at her desk for a few extra minutes. This wasn't procrastination, it was strategy. By waiting until the initial rush subsided, she could walk home without being swept up in the social currents that felt so turbulent to her sensitive nature. Mrs. Henderson approached her desk as Charlotte was packing her notebook away. "Charlotte, you're always so quiet in class. Is everything okay at home?" the teacher asked, her voice carrying genuine concern. Charlotte looked up at Mrs. Henderson's worried face and considered her response carefully. She could explain that everything was fine, that her quietness wasn't a sign of problems, but rather a sign of paying attention. She could describe how her parents were both working longer hours to pay for her brother's college applications, how her family expressed love through actions rather than words, how her home was actually a haven of understanding for her unique way of processing the world. Instead, she simply said, "Yes, Mrs. Henderson, everything is fine." Charlotte had learned that adults often wanted reassurance more than truth, and sometimes the kindest observation was knowing when not to share what she saw. Walking home alone that afternoon, Charlotte reflected on the day's discoveries. She had confirmed Jeremy's family troubles, documented the progression of Maya's social isolation, and detected early signs of bigger changes coming to their school. Her notebook was full of new observations, patterns that would help her navigate tomorrow's social landscape. But as she walked down Maple Street, watching other children playing in groups on front lawns and hearing laughter spill from open windows, Charlotte felt the familiar weight of her gift. Knowledge was powerful, but it was also isolating. She understood her classmates' motivations and fears better than they understood themselves, but this understanding created distance rather than connection. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the sidewalk as Charlotte continued her solitary journey home, carrying her observations like treasures that nobody else knew how to value. Tomorrow would bring new patterns to decode, new behaviors to analyze, new secrets to uncover in the complex world of Riverside Elementary. And Charlotte would walk to school alone again, ready to observe it all. 3 weeks had passed since Charlotte first noticed the changes at school, and her predictions were proving disturbingly accurate. Jeremy Walsh had been absent for 5 consecutive days, confirming her suspicions about his family situation. Maya Patel now spent lunch periods in the library rather than facing the increasingly hostile dynamics of the cafeteria. Most significantly, the budget cuts Mrs. Henderson and Mr. Murphy had whispered about were finally becoming visible to everyone else. Charlotte walked to school on a gray November morning, her breath creating small clouds in the cold air. The familiar route felt different somehow, charged with the tension she had been sensing for weeks. Her observation journal, now completely full, had been supplemented by a second notebook hidden in her backpack. The original had become too valuable to risk losing. It contained patterns and insights that painted a comprehensive picture of her school's hidden struggles. The playground was quieter than usual when Charlotte arrived. She immediately noticed why. The morning supervision had been reduced from 3 teachers to 1, and Mrs. Peterson, the remaining supervisor, looked overwhelmed as she tried to monitor the entire area while simultaneously unlocking the building for early arrivals. Charlotte positioned herself near the flagpole, her usual observation post, and began her morning reconnaissance. The soccer team was practicing their kicks against the brick wall, but she could see Danny Martinez sitting on the bench, his injured ankle finally forcing him to rest. 2 months of watching his increasingly careful movements had led to this inevitable outcome. She made a mental note about the importance of early intervention versus delayed consequences. Near the school entrance, a cluster of parents had gathered for what appeared to be an impromptu discussion. Charlotte recognized Mrs. Johnson, Emma's mother, and Mr. Patel, Maya's father, among others. Their body language suggested frustration. Arms crossed, voices slightly elevated, frequent gestures toward the building. Another pattern Charlotte had observed was finally reaching its tipping point. The school bell rang, and Charlotte joined the stream of students entering the building. Inside, the changes were more obvious to everyone. The hallway bulletin boards, usually refreshed weekly with student work, displayed the same projects from 3 weeks ago. The morning announcements, typically delivered with enthusiasm by Principal Garcia, sounded tired and routine. Most telling to Charlotte was the absence of Mr. Williams, the observant custodian, whose cleaning cart was being pushed by a younger man who moved with the mechanical efficiency of someone unfamiliar with the building's rhythms. In homeroom, Mrs. Henderson looked as though she hadn't slept well in days. Her usually neat desk was cluttered with papers, and she had forgotten to water the classroom plants, small details that other students missed, but that told Charlotte a story of increasing stress and overwhelm. When Maya entered the classroom, Charlotte noticed immediate changes in her appearance and demeanor. The careful way Maya moved suggested physical discomfort, and the long sleeve she wore despite the warm classroom temperature raised questions. Most concerning was how Maya's eyes darted around the room before settling on her desk, avoiding contact with other students entirely. Charlotte opened her second notebook to a fresh page and began documenting. She had developed a personal shorthand system that allowed her to record observations quickly and discreetly. Today's entry would be particularly important. She sensed that significant changes were imminent. During first period math, Charlotte's attention was divided between Mr. Thompson's lesson on fractions and her observation of Jeremy's empty desk. The teacher had stopped acknowledging the absence, which meant it had transitioned from temporary to indefinite. Charlotte noticed how the other boys in Jeremy's usual group had unconsciously shifted their desks closer together, filling the social space his absence had created. The most revealing moment came during the lesson when Mr. Thompson called on students to solve problems at the board. When he accidentally called Jeremy's name, then caught himself and looked embarrassed, Charlotte saw several of her classmates exchange glances. The adults weren't the only ones who knew more than they were saying. At recess, Charlotte observed the playground dynamics with particular attention to Maya, who had ventured outside despite her recent preference for indoor spaces. Maya stood near the building, close enough to retreat quickly if needed, watching other students play with the expression of someone looking through a window rather than being part of the scene. Charlotte made a decision that went against her usual pattern of non-intervention. She approached Maya slowly, giving her plenty of opportunity to move away if she preferred to be alone. The maple tree by the fence has interesting patterns in its bark, Charlotte said quietly, offering an observation rather than a direct social overture. Maya looked at her with surprise, then toward the tree Charlotte had mentioned. "I haven't noticed," she replied carefully. "Most people don't notice details," Charlotte continued. "But sometimes the details tell you more than the big picture." For the next few minutes, they stood together in comfortable silence, both watching the playground activities from their shared position as observers rather than participants. Charlotte sensed that Maya appreciated having someone nearby, without the pressure of forced conversation or artificial cheerfulness. When the bell rang, signaling the end of recess, Maya quietly said, "Thank you for noticing the tree." Charlotte understood that Maya was thanking her for more than botanical observations. Lunch period brought the most significant development of the day. Charlotte was eating her sandwich, and making notes about the changing social configurations in the cafeteria, when Principal Garcia entered with two adults she didn't recognize, a woman in a business suit and a man carrying an official-looking folder. They moved through the room with the purposeful stride of people conducting an evaluation. Charlotte watched as they observed the lunch staff, counted students at tables, and made notes on clipboards. When they paused near the teacher's table, Charlotte employed her lip-reading skills to understand their conversation. The words compliance and staffing ratios appeared frequently, confirming her suspicions about the nature of their visit. More interesting was the reaction of the school staff. Mrs. Henderson kept glancing toward the visitors with barely concealed anxiety. The lunch supervisors moved with unusual formality, clearly aware they were being evaluated. Even the students seemed to sense the tension, though most couldn't identify its source. Charlotte's most significant observation came when the official visitors approached a table of students to ask questions about their lunch experience. The woman in the business suit specifically asked about adult supervision and whether students felt safe during lunch period. The questions themselves revealed what they were investigating. After lunch, Charlotte noticed that Maya was absent from their shared science class. This was unusual. Maya's attendance had been consistent despite her social withdrawal. Charlotte made a note to check the nurse's office route on her way to the next class, a strategy that had proven useful for gathering information about absent students. Her detour past the nurse's office confirmed her suspicion. Through the partially open door, she could see Maya sitting on the examination bed while the school nurse, Mrs. Rodriguez, spoke quietly on the phone. Charlotte caught fragments of the conversation, parental contact, and appropriate follow-up, phrases that suggested Maya's absence was more significant than a simple illness. In her final class of the day, Charlotte reflected on the mounting evidence of systemic changes at Riverside Elementary. The budget cuts were affecting supervision and maintenance. Staff stress was increasing, leading to decreased attention to student needs. Students like Jeremy were disappearing from the system without adequate support. Others, like Maya, were showing signs of distress that weren't being addressed effectively. As a dismissal bell rang, Charlotte lingered in the hallway to observe the afternoon pickup routine. She noticed that several regular parent volunteers were missing, and the remaining staff looked overwhelmed by the chaos of coordinating student dismissal with reduced personnel. Walking toward the exit, Charlotte passed the main office and noticed unusual activity inside. Through the glass doors, she could see Principal Garcia in what appeared to be a tense discussion with the two official visitors from lunch. Their body language suggested disagreement or concern about policy compliance. Outside the building, the parent gathering Charlotte had noticed that morning had grown larger and more organized. She recognized many faces from school events. Active parents who typically supported the administration, but now appeared frustrated and concerned. Mrs. Johnson was speaking to the group, her voice carrying enough to reveal keywords like safety, supervision, and accountability. Charlotte realized she was witnessing a pivotal moment in her school's history. The patterns she had been tracking for weeks were converging into a crisis that would likely bring significant changes. Her observations had predicted this outcome, but she felt no satisfaction in being right. Only a deep concern for how these changes would affect students who were already struggling. On her walk home, Charlotte mentally reviewed the day's developments. Jeremy's prolonged absence suggested family problems that the school system wasn't equipped to address. Maya's concerning behavior indicated another child falling through the cracks of an overwhelmed support system. The official investigation implied that external authorities were already aware of the problem Charlotte had been documenting. Most troubling was the realization that her unique observational abilities had allowed her to see these issues developing long before adults recognized them. This raised questions about whether her silence in the face of mounting evidence made her complicit in the problems she observed. As she turned onto Maple Street, Charlotte noticed Mrs. Patterson, her elderly neighbor, tending to her garden despite the cold weather. Mrs. Patterson looked up and waved, a gesture that had become part of Charlotte's daily routine. "How was school today, dear?" Mrs. Patterson called out. Charlotte paused at the fence, considering her response. Mrs. Patterson was one of the few adults who seemed genuinely interested in her observations rather than dismissing them as childhood imagination. "There are many changes today," Charlotte replied carefully. "I think there will be more changes coming." Mrs. Patterson nodded knowingly. Sometimes change is necessary, even when it's difficult. The important thing is making sure the right people are paying attention. As Charlotte continued toward her house, she reflected on Mrs. Patterson's words. Perhaps her role as an observer carried more responsibility than she had realized. Perhaps noticing patterns and understanding problems was only valuable if that knowledge could somehow be used to help others. That evening, Charlotte sat at her bedroom desk with both observation notebooks open before her. The first was completely full, documenting months of careful observations about her school community. The second was rapidly filling with evidence of the crisis she had predicted. Together, they told a comprehensive story of institutional breakdown and individual struggles that most adults remained unaware of. For the first time, Charlotte considered the possibility that her observations might be valuable to someone besides herself. The question was how to share her insights without revealing the extent of her surveillance of the adults and children around her. Outside her bedroom window, Maple Street was quiet in the gathering darkness. Tomorrow would bring new observations, new patterns to decode, and new evidence of the changes transforming her school. But tonight, Charlotte wondered if it was time to stop being merely an observer and find a way to become part of the solution. The decision to act came to Charlotte on a snowy December morning when she arrived at school to find Maya Patel sitting alone on the front steps, 20 minutes before the building would open. Maya's position, hunched forward with her arms wrapped around her knees, spoke of someone who had nowhere else to go. Charlotte approached slowly, her footsteps muffled by the fresh snow. She sat down beside Maya, without speaking, understanding that sometimes presence was more powerful than words. They remained like this for several minutes, two 11-year-old girls watching their breath create clouds in the cold air while snow accumulated on their shoulders. "My parents had another fight," Maya finally whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind. "I couldn't stay in the house." Charlotte had suspected domestic troubles in Maya's home for weeks, but hearing it confirmed made her chest tighten with a mixture of vindication and sadness. She reached in her backpack and pulled out a thermos her mother had packed with hot chocolate, originally intended for her own lunch, but Maya's need was clearly greater. "Sometimes adults forget that children can hear everything," Charlotte said, unscrewing the thermos cap and handing it to Maya. "They think we don't understand, but we understand too much." Maya accepted the warm drink gratefully, her cold fingers wrapping around the metal cup. "You always seem to know things before other people do," she observed. "How do you do that?" Charlotte considered the question carefully. She had never attempted to explain her observational abilities to another child, partly because she wasn't entirely sure how to describe them, and partly because adults had always dismissed her insights as childhood imagination. "I watch and listen," she said simply, "not just to what people say, but to what they don't say. Not just to what they do, but to what they avoid doing." Maya nodded slowly. "Like how I've been avoiding the cafeteria because the popular girls make comments about my clothes. And like how Jeremy stopped talking about his weekend plans because there were no plans to talk about," Charlotte added. "And like how Mrs. Henderson keeps checking her email during class because she's worried about layoffs." For the first time in weeks, Maya smiled. "You really do see everything." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Principal Garcia, who looked surprised to find two students waiting outside in the snow. His expression shifted to concern when he noticed Maya's red-rimmed eyes and Charlotte's protective posture beside her. "Girls, why are you here so early?" he asked, unlocking the main door and gesturing for them to come inside where it was warm. Charlotte exchanged a glance with Maya, recognizing this as a potential turning point. She could deflect the question with a vague answer about arriving early to study, where she could take the unprecedented step of sharing her observations with an adult who might be able to help. Mr. Garcia, Charlotte said carefully, I think Maya needs someone to talk to about what's happening at home. The principal's attention immediately focused on Maya, who looked startled by Charlotte's directness. Is that right, Maya? Is everything okay at home? Maya hesitated, clearly torn between her instinct to minimize problems and her evident need for support. Charlotte recognized the internal struggle. She had observed it in dozens of students over the months. It's okay to tell the truth, Charlotte said quietly. Adults can't help if they don't know what's really happening. This moment of encouragement seemed to give Maya the courage she needed. In halting sentences, she described the escalating arguments at home, her parents' financial stress, and her own growing anxiety about her safety and stability. Principal Garcia listened with increasing concern, occasionally asking gentle, clarifying questions. When Maya finished speaking, Principal Garcia knelt down to her eye level. Maya, I'm glad you told me about this. We have people who can help, and you shouldn't have to deal with these worries alone. He looked up at Charlotte with something approaching amazement. Charlotte, how did you know Maya needed help? Charlotte felt the familiar weight of her observations pressing against her consciousness. For months, she had collected evidence of problems throughout her school community. Students struggling with family issues, staff overwhelmed by impossible demands, systems failing to support the people who needed them most. She had documented patterns and predicted outcomes with remarkable accuracy, but she had always kept this knowledge to herself. Now, faced with an adult who seemed genuinely interested in understanding and helping, Charlotte made a decision that would change everything. I keep track of things, she said simply. I notice when people are struggling, even when they try to hide it. Principal Garcia sat down on the floor so he could speak with both girls at eye level. What kind of things do you notice, Charlotte? Charlotte glanced around the empty hallway, then back at the principal's face. She saw a genuine curiosity there, not the dismissive patience adults often displayed when children try to share their observations. I noticed that Jeremy Walsh hasn't been to school in 2 weeks because his mother left and his father is drinking more, Charlotte said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was revealing. I noticed that Danny Martinez has been playing soccer with an injured ankle because he's afraid of disappointing his parents who want him to get a sports scholarship. I noticed that Mrs. Henderson has been taking phone calls during her planning period about her mother's medical bills. The principal's expression grew more serious with each observation. Charlotte, these are very specific concerns. How do you know about these situations? I watch people, Charlotte explained. I listen to conversations adults think children can't hear. I notice when behavior patterns change. I see connections that other people miss. She paused, then added, and I write it all down. Principal Garcia looked intrigued rather than alarmed. You keep records of your observations? Charlotte nodded, then made another unprecedented decision. She pulled her observation journals from her backpack and handed them to the principal. These have everything I've noticed since the beginning of the school year. While Principal Garcia carefully examined the notebooks, Charlotte explained her system of documentation. She described how she had tracked Jeremy's deteriorating family situation, predicted the budget cuts before they were announced, identified students who were being bullied or excluded, and recognized staff members who were struggling with personal or professional challenges. Charlotte, the principal said finally, looking up from the journals with astonishment, this is remarkable work. You've identified problems that our counseling staff and teachers haven't recognized. How did you develop these observational skills? Charlotte considered the question. I think I've always noticed things differently, she said. But I started writing everything down after my grandmother told me that observing was a gift, and gifts should be used to help people. Maya, who had been listening to this conversation with growing amazement, spoke up. Is that why you helped me this morning? Because you observed that I needed help? I observed it weeks ago, Charlotte admitted. But I wasn't sure how to help without making things worse. Principal Garcia stood up, still holding Charlotte's journals. Would you be willing to share these observations with our school counselor and some of our teachers? I think your insights could help us support students and staff more effectively. Charlotte felt a mixture of excitement and apprehension. She had always assumed that adults wouldn't take her observations seriously, but Principal Garcia's reaction suggested otherwise. "I want to help," she said, "but I don't want people to feel like I was spying on them." "What you've been doing isn't spying," Principal Garcia assured her. "It's caring enough to pay attention. There's a big difference." Over the following weeks, Charlotte found herself in the unprecedented position of consulting with adults about the social and emotional dynamics of her school community. The school counselor, Ms. Williams, met with Charlotte twice a week to review her observations and develop intervention strategies for struggling students. Jeremy Walsh was connected with family services and began receiving support for his father's alcoholism. Maya Patel's parents were referred to mediation services to help them resolve their conflicts more constructively. Danny Martinez was evaluated by the school nurse and referred to physical therapy for his ankle injury, with his parents educated about the dangers of playing through pain. Most significantly, Charlotte's detailed documentation of staff stress and resource shortages was shared with the school district administration and parent committee. Her observations provided concrete evidence of the problems that had been developing over months, helping administrators understand the root causes of declining school performance. Charlotte's role evolved from silent observer to active participant in her school community's well-being. She continued to document patterns and behaviors, but now she shared her insights with adults who could act on them. Teachers began consulting with her about students who seemed withdrawn or troubled. The counselor used Charlotte's behavioral observations to identify children who might benefit from additional support. Perhaps most importantly, other students began to recognize Charlotte's unique abilities and sought her out for help understanding confusing social situations or developing strategies for dealing with interpersonal challenges. Maya became Charlotte's closest friend and collaborator, helping her understand how it felt to be on the receiving end of the problems Charlotte observed. The transformation wasn't without challenges. Some students were uncomfortable knowing that Charlotte had been documenting their behavior, and a few parents expressed concerns about privacy. Charlotte learned to be more selective about what she recorded and to focus her observations on patterns that indicated need for support rather than cataloging every detail of people's lives. She also discovered that being known for her observational abilities changed how people interacted with her. Some became more guarded, while others sought her out specifically because they wanted someone to notice their struggles. Charlotte had to learn how to balance her natural tendency to observe with respect for others' privacy and autonomy. By spring, Charlotte's daily walk to school looked very different. Maya often joined her, and sometimes other students would fall in a step with them along the way. Charlotte still observed everything around her. That fundamental aspect of her personality hadn't changed, but now her observations were part of a broader network of caring and support. On a warm May morning, as Charlotte walked down Maple Street, surrounded by a small group of friends, she reflected on the journey that had brought her from silent observer to active participant. She still noticed details that others missed. The way Mr. Peterson favored his left leg, the nervous habit Maya had of tucking her hair behind her ear, the subtle signs of stress in Mrs. Henderson's posture. But now these observations were tools for helping rather than secrets to be hoarded. The greatest change, Charlotte realized, wasn't in her ability to observe, but in her understanding of observation's purpose. Noticing problems was only valuable if that knowledge could be transformed into action. Seeing people's struggles was only meaningful if it led to offering support. Her gift hadn't changed, but her willingness to share it had transformed not only her own life, but the lives of everyone around her. As she approached the school building that morning, surrounded by friends who had learned to value her unique perspective, Charlotte understood that true observation wasn't about standing apart from the world to study it. It was about looking closely enough to see where help was needed and then stepping forward to provide it. The silent observer had found her voice, and in doing so, had discovered that the most powerful observations were the ones that led to connection rather than isolation. Charlotte still chose to walk her own path, but Now she walked it with the knowledge that sometimes the most important thing you can observe is an opportunity to help.